So the world is urbanizing at a rapid pace, right? You've, for the first time in 2007, had more than 50% of the world's population living in cities. And by 2050, that number is projected to be 70 to 75%. And it's estimated that 70% of the infrastructure needed to house that population hasn't even been built yet. And cities are facing different kinds of risks than they have in the past. They are vulnerable to the usual shocks, the earthquake, hurricane, typhoon, terrorism, kinds of quick, sudden events, but also to the slow burn, chronic stresses, long-term food, water, and energy shortage, high levels of crime and violence that impacted a city like Medellin over the decades of the 80s and 90s, or shifting macroeconomic trends. It's worth pointing out that the one city in the US that was almost wiped off the map wasn't because of an earthquake or a hurricane. It was Detroit, overexposed to a single industry, the American automobile industry, and that industry became less and less competitive. And the center city of Detroit is being demapped. Whole blocks are being taken out of commission. And you can think of that, that's Detroit. But, even a city like Singapore or our cities of Rotterdam or Panama City, who are very exposed to the shipping industry. What happens when 3D printing disrupts global shipping? That will have less in Singapore because it's a very diversified economy, but for a city like Rotterdam or Panama City, real impacts. And so urban resilience is about a city's ability to survive all those things, to survive and thrive in the face of whatever shocks or stresses it faces. And that's why it's so important in the 21st century. So I think in some ways, resilience is about changing how you approach problems. And there are four qualities or characteristics that cities can adopt. One is an integrated approach. Too often, transport people talk to transport people, economic development people talk to economic development people, and housing people talk to housing people. And what that misses some real risks, and it also misses opportunities. And so what resilient cities do is they have those conversations across both sectors, but also silos between civil society, the private sector, and government. The second is to be more inclusive. The more we engage with all parts of society, the more resilient a city is. And the less we do that, actually, the more fragile a city is. And a good example of that is the Arab Spring. You had cities that, on the face of it, had a lot of wealth. But they had two classes of society where the one class didn't feel like the city was operating for them. You took one fruit vendor in Tunis to set himself on fire and the whole region burned. So inclusivity, to get all voices at the table actively, not just as a show, but to do that actively, that's the second thing. The third and fourth thing are risk-aware, but forward-looking. And risk-aware means you need to design your city with the hazards, the 100-year flood, seismic code, whatever those things are. Make sure you know what the hazards are that you know that you're going to face, and design for that. That's absolutely important. But with climate change, we know that the past is not going to be necessarily a good predictor of the future. So forward-looking is understanding that the 100-year flood may not happen once every 100 years anymore. It might happen on a 1 in 50 basis or 1 in 25 basis, and understanding that within the rapidly changing environment our cities are in, we need to be forward-looking and proactive. So we like to talk about something called the resilience dividend. That it's not just about the benefits you get from the thing that you're doing, but also the ancillary benefits that strengthen the city across a number of other factors. And cycling is one of the best examples of this. You might do cycling, expand a cycling network in order to promote better mobility. But then it also has health benefits, and keeps the population in your hospitals and your emergency departments lower. It has many proven benefits for small and medium-sized enterprises because foot and cycle traffic on the streets actually leads to better results for shop owners. It has community cohesion benefits because now we know our neighbors. We're interacting with people on the street, not just blowing by them in a car. It has environmental benefits because we're not our climate footprint is lower in cycle-friendly communities. And so through one intervention, you strengthen yourself across a number of different dimensions. And that's what makes cities more resilient. It's not that, a city looks at itself and says, we need to improve mobility. Yeah, of course you need to improve mobility, but the next thing that happens is not going to challenge your mobility. The next thing that happens might challenge your public health system with an epidemic or an outbreak. It might challenge your economic base. And that's why you need small and medium-sized enterprises and diverse middle-class jobs. We don't know what the next thing is. And what resilience says is that you need to strengthen yourself across those factors. So I lived in Singapore from 2008 to 2010, and I was a cyclist even then. And one of the things that I've noticed is the massive increase in cycling over those years from when I left at the end of 2010 to now, which is 2017. There's been an incredible uptick. You see it in different kinds of cyclists, the sports cyclists, the commuting cyclists, the bike messengers. You see all of that on the roads. You see it in the shops. So many more shops for cycling and to buy bikes and bike apparel and those things. And you see it in the Park Connector network. It's much more expanded. So the connectivity where you can get to, it has greatly increased. I used to live for a while in Tangzhongru. And I could not, because that link to Marina Barrage wasn't open, it was very hard for me to get from there to the CBD. And now that's a much easier commute. And that's the kind of thing that I'll cycle on the roads, I'll cycle anywhere. But lots of people, in order to have this really catch and become mainstream, you need to have the safest possible cycle network. And that's something that Singapore has done quite well. Okay. Can I? So the thing I think that's interesting that is different from between Singapore and some of the Western cities, particularly I'm thinking about North American cities, is that North American cities put cyclists on the roads, and Singapore where they allow cyclists on the sidewalks. And I think that neither of those options are good. What you need to do is build proper, allocate proper road space for cyclists. And not have them mixing with pedestrians on very crowded small sidewalks, as we know, and not having them in the regular lanes and mixing with cars. You need to dedicate some space for that. And I know that there will be, as there is in every single city around the world, when you take away road space from cars and you allocate it to cyclists, at first there's this hue and cry of protest. But cars make up such a small part of the population. In any city, a very small part of the population actually gets to work via the single occupancy vehicle. It's much more the people who are taking the MRT or the bus network or walking or cycling. And so part of what planners need to have is the fortitude to say, we need to reallocate road space in a more fair and equitable way. And actually, if we do it, we're going to make our city stronger, more sustainable, more resilient. And I think that's, if you think about the errors of Singapore cycling, at first it was just establishing a park connector network. Then it was this rapid increase that I think has been going over the last, say, 7 to 10 years. And then the next one will be really legitimizing it as a mainstream mode of transportation that will make Singapore an even stronger city than it is today. I mean, the best are some of the obvious ones, and they're the Dutch cities or the Danish cities or German cities. They have allocated large parts of the road network to protected cycle lanes, and they have thousands and thousands, very high percentage of their commuters go by bike. I would say that there's a big advantage in Northern Europe in that you have very good climate for it. It doesn't get too hot or too cold. And it's relatively flat. And in many places it doesn't rain that much either. Even though, I'll give you an example, I used to live in London. People think of London as this rainy place. It rains actually by inches half as much in London as it does in New York. And what you get is just lots of cloud cover. So it makes cycling to work, to the pub, to your friend's house, a relatively easy and pleasant experience. And so in some ways, those natural advantages make those cities the best. But I'm very excited about the cities that are beginning this journey, like Singapore, like New York, where you see these large expansions in cycle networks, and really thinking about how to do this. One of our cities, New Orleans, is actually in the process of expanding bike share with an equity lens. So to the poorest and most vulnerable communities, to help them create the critical link between these transportation deserts and public transportation. And so in some ways, yeah, it would be easy to say Northern Europe because that is where it's most pleasant. But it's the cities at the forefront that are really using this as a tool for equity and resilience and sustainability where I'm most excited. I think Singapore has been doing resilience for a long time. And one of the things we did yesterday, and it's not the first time I've seen it, but cycled over Marina Barrage. Marina Barrage is a great example of a resilient project, or a project that builds resilience. Because if you had given that just to the engineers, they would have built the barrage and created, a freshwater body and been done with it. But what the barrage does in the way that it's currently constructed is it creates this link between East Coast and the CBD. It made possible much of the development that's behind there, the recreation, biodiversity, places for families to meet and exercise and drive, and become healthier. It did all those things, and you did it with the community and community participation, which strengthens Singapore and makes it more resilient. So, here's one project that had multiple benefits to strengthen the city and the nation, in this case, across a bunch of different outcomes. And so I think, and this is not the only project that Singapore has taken this approach to. So Singapore has been doing this for a long time. What we hope is that Singapore helps share some of those lessons on how to take that approach. And to do that effectively for other cities, which all look to Singapore and try to emulate the city. At the same time, we are living in a dynamic time. And if Singapore doesn't keep learning, keep evolving, keep getting better, then it will stand still and it will become less and less resilient and less of a leader. Because your workforce is changing, your economic environment is changing, the climate, you're exposed to existential climate threat issues, whether that's rain and fresh water or sea level rise and storm surge. Like all of those things threaten this small nation in an existential way. And so Singapore's got to look outside as it's been doing and learn. And so that's my expectation. Both that this city, which has been such a leader, teaches the other 99 cities in the 100 Resilient Cities Network, but also that it learns and continues to improve because this is a great place to live and work.